No, I wasn't talking about that.
What were you talking about?
Hi, I'm Andy,
And I'm Roger,
and welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics.
on our search to find the middle.
That's fatphobic.
I don't feel war. I just own a way to see war.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
I act as if God exists.
Put your masks on.
How dare you! You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words.
Hey Roger, how you going?
Hi, Andy. Yeah, very, very tired. Bad night with the kid.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear it. You've only got yourself to blame.
I feel like my life's a little bit like Fight Club, you know, where he's so sleep deprived that he's not sure like which reality he's in.
You know, I was up really late last night reading, you know, you get in those Wikipedia rabbit warrens.
Yeah.
I was reading this page about bombing in Japan during World War II. And so, I mean, this is broadly how it goes. These planes, US bombers, departed the Mariana Islands in the Pacific, made their way over Japan and bombed the Japanese city. 100,000 estimated civilians dead in one night. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the popular narrative that I understood it growing up, and you know, you don't reflect on it so much growing up, and you kind of almost get to the end of the justification very quickly. And then when you grow up and you actually think about it, and you think about you're more in touch with the value of life, and you have a family and whatever it is, you do start to reflect on how absolutely horrific it is from a human point of view, from a humanitarian point of view. But I must admit, growing up, I always very much saw it as the justification that ended the war, saved millions of lives. And yeah, certainly. And I think this is where it's very powerful to listen to firsthand accounts of survivors and people on the ground. And, you know, there's that watershed article in the New York Post about that. Sorry, the New Yorker that was very famous about taking a victim's standpoint that really changed the narrative at the time, and actually has changed journalism to this day, trying to make it more of a human story. So yeah, I must admit, it's the more you dwell on it, the more kind of shocking it is, right? How about you? Was it good bedtime reading? Sweet dreams?
Well, apart from that, you're talking about Nagasaki and Hiroshima, right?
I am, yes.
No, I wasn't talking about that.
What were you talking about?
Bombing of Tokyo.
Oh, bombing of Tokyo. Oh, sorry, I totally misunderstood.
No, but like that's the point, though, isn't it? Right? If you said that 100,000 people lost their life from bombing events conducted in World War II, and you know, in one night, one city, one night, 100,000 deaths. I mean, everyone is thinking that it's the atomic bomb, right? It's like this unprecedented event, right? But as you track back through the history, you start to realize that events like Nagasaki and Hiroshima, maybe not quite to the same scale, but like they were a dime a dozen.
When you look at it from fatalities, yes, I would say so. But I think that that bombing of Tokyo was using a very different technology. Many, many bombs dropped over the course of that period of that engagement.
Coming back and having a look at the bombing of Tokyo, and this is on 10th of March 1945, is, I think, a good way to put yourself back in the mindset of, you know, the people who were tasked to make the decision about dropping the bomb, right? So I think when we today in 2023 cast our minds to this question, we see this really like we think of it through like an ethical lens of like, is it right to do an action that has such devastation to so many people? But they had already crossed that threshold. They'd already crossed the Rubicon, you know, on that. So it wasn't that wasn't the factor that was preventing them from engaging in this sort of a decision. They had the technology, they had the weapon, and the prospect was a war that would go on for many more years. So they made the call to use what they had and end the war and potentially save many more thousands of lives in the process.
Cross the Rubicon, the die is cast, hey? Yeah, I mean, I think that's the context piece, right? Like that it's very, very hard for people that are sitting outside the sphere of active warfare to really understand the mindset at the time. You know, it's probably near impossible in some ways.
think we should maybe go back and talk about the context, because today we're talking about nuclear weapons, which is a pretty serious topic, but at the same time, when we're going to do it justice in the non-serious way that we treat every other topic. But yeah, maybe like, Roger, what's your like elevator pitch understanding of the history of nuclear weapons and what got us to that point in 1945?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've learnt most of my knowledge of nuclear weapons by that opening scene of James Cameron's Judgment Day 2 Against the Fence, you know. So that's really where, you know, that was my education growing up. The hopeless yelling, the shaking of the cage, no, and the...
Mine was Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, but I think you...
You were a grown man by the time the Crystal Skull came out. Look, I think that... I kind of think that what we're really talking about here is the discoveries and the scientific advancements of nuclear physics, right? So there was discoveries, you know, somewhere between, let's just call it in the 30s, there was discoveries around nuclear fission. This was mainly driven by German scientists, and they understood how, you know, qualities about the atom and the fact that there was a large amount of energy to be harvested or released when certain parts of the atom were pried apart, right? So that was the kind of kernel of the scientific discovery. Before it was, we worried about how it was applied, right? And fast forward to, obviously, the wars, World War I and World War II, especially World War II, really. The Axis powers, and specifically Germany, were really developing, using their scientific community to leverage and develop nuclear weapons. And in response to that, in secret, was the establishment of the Manhattan Project.
They had to really do that because they were, you know, quite fearful that, you know, just thinking in the minds of like the Americans, I suppose, was that if they didn't do that, they were at risk of being second. And with something like nuclear weapons, being second, you may as well be last.
There was a letter, actually, a plea from the scientific community sponsored by Albert Einstein, urging them to actually make sure that they had a strategy around nuclear weapons before it got into the hands of the Germans in an operational manner. So there was this kind of plea from the scientific community who could understand how these breakthroughs in nuclear physics could be used.
Do you know what I think so amazing is like how they managed to keep it secret? Not just in terms of, you know, the Germany not finding out or Japan not finding out, but even like their allied partners didn't know. Like the UK didn't know. It was like really, really, really like...
Yeah, VP. I mean, the vice president probably doesn't know that much to begin with, but...
Yeah, I mean, like, so Truman was ultimately the president who decided to drop the bomb in Japan, but like when he was vice president, he didn't know.
Oh man, can you imagine that briefing?
About it after... Wait, but like, and he's got to make the decision to do it when Roosevelt died. So
talk about a hot radiated potato to be dropped in your lap.
Do you think they had the nuclear football back then?
Oh, I actually just like, I want to be there when they were pitching the shape of it. Like, did they actually kind of think maybe some kind of football shaped thing that opened up like one of those football phones you could get in the 80s?
Well, while we're on the topic of the shape of things, what do you reckon about the names Fat Man and Little Boy?
Oh, I love it. I love it. Like that's such an American thing. You know what I mean? It's like we have this, you know, technology that is literally this destroyer of worlds. You know, Oppenheimer famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita, like, you know, become destruction, the destroyer of worlds, and then they give it such humorous names. It just shows that dichotomy of like the scientific and entrepreneurial brilliance of America and Americans, and also the cowboy nature of them as well. It's like we've got the best tech, but we're also going to draw a demon face on the tip of our missiles, you know, because we're America and we have to have it both ways, right? We are redneck. We're rednecks, and we're the most advanced civilization on Earth.
I remember seeing some sort of documentary where, like, the actual Air Force, like the people who worked in the bomber squadrons, they didn't know what they were doing until I think they were in the air or something. So there was some extra theatre to it. I'm not sure if that's quite right, but yeah, just this knowing that they were doing this momentous, you know, task. And I think some of the people who were tasked to load it into the aircraft, I think there were photos of them with it. I'm not sure that they signed it or something, but like, yeah, it's just, that was like the Enola Gay, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing, and this is all kind of after the fact, right, where all these details came out and declassified documents and things. But at the time, it was all just a need to know basis. You know, I agree. It's unfathomable how secretive, you know, and how cloak and dagger all of this was.
Well, you wouldn't want to drop a fat man or a little boy from a plane. It might have devastating consequences.
Or just like, you know, tell them, because if they're anything like the baggage handlers that I see loading other things into planes, you know, just like throwing shit around, like maybe that's not what you want.
So back to our friends in the desert in continental United States. Like, wasn't it that like Oppenheimer was one of the German physicists involved in this, and I think the person who was leading it spoke about or warned against like this, and it was probably considered a remote possibility, but that nonetheless they couldn't rule out that it would cause like a chain reaction, and by detonating the nuclear bomb, it would actually it wouldn't just have like the contained explosion that we sort of think of today, but it would literally destroy everything in the universe. If not the universe, then, you know, certainly everything that we've come to know and love. So you know, just like playing with fire in that way. It reminds me a little bit of even some of the conversations we had, you know, a few episodes ago on artificial intelligence, where we're sort of just playing around with this technology that might be really, really destructive, but we don't quite know. But we'll just keep going ahead anyway because it has like a short-term like benefit to us.
Hey, baby, when the government gives you funding, you know, you don't turn it down. Because what's a scientist without funding for their research? No, but they did their first test in the New Mexico desert, July 16th, 1945. And the kind of test bomb that they used was called Trinity. And you're right, they didn't really know, because the whole way the bomb works is about, I suppose, exciting the atoms and causing a chain reaction and release of energy of the atoms, right? So they didn't know exactly how and when it would stop. And I think it must have been, they were all just absolutely blown away. And actually, I would, can you imagine being there in that bunker, watching that mushroom cloud? Like, it must have been the most surreal experience ever, and made you feel so small and yet godlike, because you are the part of the team that actually created that, right? It gives me chills to this day, this kind of deep understanding that now that this has been birthed into the world, nothing will be the same, right? We have a godlike power to destroy.
I think the critical thing with that is, prior to this point in history, there really was no other human intervention to destroy literally everything known to mankind. Like, this was us crossing the precipice of being able to destroy human civilization. I mean, sure, there was man-motivated sort of pandemics and things like that in the past, but plague and all that sort of stuff, but that was really biology and humans interacting. But this was really putting the tools in someone's toolkit to destroy the planet. And I think that's, you know, gave birth to the nuclear age, I guess, and what we all still fear and talk about today.
And I think this is like something that is really resonant from Nick Bostrom, right? Do you want to kind of talk through his like marble, his urn analogy when it comes to this stuff?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I'm shocked that you just assumed that I could recount to you the marbles in the urn analogy, but I'll give my best crack off the cuff. Is this thought experiment that you've got like a box, right? A magic box. And in the box, there's just like, almost imagine like marbles, and each marble contains like an innovation, something, some new technology that's available to us. And if you keep drawing from the urn or the box, as I've converted it to, mostly you'll be fine, right? Okay, this is the wheel, and this is telecommunications, this is the light bulb or whatever. Yeah. And that's great. Like, that helps us all. Like, we benefit on a day-to-day basis. But some proportion of those innovations in that urn or in that box, some number of the marbles in the box are potentially catastrophic for mankind, right?
Yeah.
And we've talked already on this show about some of them, like AI being probably the most salient one in recent episodes. But yeah, I mean, like, nuclear technology is another one, because once you start sort of playing with that kind of firepower, that's powerful. So I guess anyway, the prospect is that, eventually we'll all kill ourselves. So live it up, right?
It's
By the way, I've probably butchered that, so please mop up all my mistakes.
and of course I assume that you know that analogy because you do. But yeah, I think this kind of, he classifies it as white and pink marbles being the innocent ones, right? And black ones being the life-threatening or existential threats.
Of course,
right?
They had to be black, right?
I know you're trying to kind of not be colorist, but I love the way that he also describes it as we're babies, right? We're actually like humanity is like babies reaching into an urn blindly, and in some ways that's true, right? Like when we reach in to grab it, we don't know, we can't recognize what it is, and we don't even know what it is until we play around with it, and by then it's a bit late. And I think the bit that I find really interesting is this idea of his principle around the urn and marbles, white and black marbles, and as a bit of a theory for perhaps why there isn't more intelligent life in the universe. Because basically, as civilizations advance, they pick out more and more of these marbles from the urn. And if you keep on picking them out, you're bound to come up against a black one eventually. And so the reason why there's not more advanced life on Earth is that we blow ourselves up, or we do something, we pick a marble up that we don't understand. And of course, we can't get past that threshold, that constriction. And that's really an interesting thought for me.
Well, I think we'll avoid getting into his simulation thought experiment. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the development of nuclear weapons and how they came into fruition, albeit in a very ad hoc kind of way. But I think we should now get to the ethical aspects of it. And we opened up with a little bit of a discussion on the ethics of dropping a bomb on, civilians who, really kind of innocent. But there's so much more to this than just that, right? You sort of alluded to it in the beginning when you mentioned that it's a new technology that has this new power. What do you think, or what would you say are like the key ethical quandaries or considerations about nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really hard one to break down, I think, without a good framework. I mean, you can go with your gut feel, or you can take a very much like look at the schools of thought, right? And I've often flipped between the two, right? Like I've tried to take it from my gut and kind of try to express my own ways, but then I think there's value in looking at the different frameworks that exist out there. I find like a really good one actually that breaks away from all these semantics around, consequentialism and pacifism and all these kind of different things. I like to actually take it back to all the way back to a medieval style view of it.
I thought you were going to say the prisoner experiment, but
no, not yet. I've got that jam for later. All the way back to a good friend of mine, a good Catholic boy called Thomas Aquinas. And for all his shortcomings and faults, I think that he described it in a really easy way that you can apply to everything. And that for me is like, he kind of looked at whether something is moral or immoral based on three components. The first one being the object of the act. So it's kind of like what's being done, right? And whether it's good or bad. So obviously like killing someone is wrong, helping someone is good, blah, blah, blah. The second is the intention or the end. So like why is it being done? What is the goal? And then the third final one is the circumstances, right? So this is the contextual elements that we were talking about, right? And I find like when all is said and done in terms of the different schools of thought that you can come from, it's actually a really good framework to kind of like break it down in those three different ways. Like what is someone's intention and how are they meeting that, right? And why are they doing that? What's the circumstance? Like, I think that's, for me, provides a really good framework to look at it. I mean, how do you come at it, Andy, in terms of ethics?
Probably a little bit differently, to take out the element that's connected to the individual actions of any single person, but to actually consider that these are decisions made within a system, so within like a complex, interactive or an escalating situation. So this technology came about because of a world war, right? And it was developed because of fear that a belligerent power, Germany, would develop it. And that spurred the need and the ambition and the incentive to, well, we needed it as well. And that's just really the beginning of the arms race that we've seen, like even today, right? And so the question then becomes like, if you're, let's say, a power that wants to develop and build that capability, are you somehow like ethically liable because you've just done something that you feel you've had to do because someone else is doing it? And that gets quite complicated. Now, in terms of an actual decision to drop the bomb or use it, well, we've only had that happen twice in the whole of human history, being Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we could probably synthesize that into one decision, really. And it was used once, and it was used under very unique circumstances. And I think the uniqueness of those circumstances included both that it was to save, potentially thousands and thousands or hundreds of thousands of lives, because I think the thinking at that time was that, they would need to have troops in Japan to defeat Japan, and there would be no other way. And that's one part of it. But then it was also unique because no other power had nuclear weapons at that period of history. And there was a period of history where the United States had the monopoly on nuclear power. So they basically could have done anything they liked, right? And there were even some within the US administration at the time saying, no, we should actually nuke the shit out of Russia, right? They're going to get this thing, so we've got to destroy their capability to get it, right? We've got to get on the front foot. Otherwise, we're going to have this Cold War, which anyway ended up eventuating, and which we still in some ways have today. So, but of course, the right call was made. Sanity prevailed, and that didn't happen. But we've entered this zone of mad, mutually assured destruction where you wouldn't, or at least the theory is you wouldn't do a first strike nuclear attack because you'll get it back and it wouldn't be good for you either.
All right. Well, I think we're kind of heading there anyway. So to cut through some of the conceptualizing of these ethics, why don't we zoom in on the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And why don't we do like a middle segment on it with arguments for dropping the bomb and arguments against dropping the bomb? You want to take for or against?
Well, I'll take for.
All right, hit me.
All right. Well, the arguments for was that as we started this episode off, they were doing this anyway, right? There was nothing novel about bombing a city and killing that many people to try and win the war, right? And if you think about it through a consequentialist lens, as in, you want to minimize bad consequences, the expectation is there would be more bombing, you would have had more troops and civilian lives lost. They shortcut that by dropping the bomb, right? So yes, it was bad in terms of 100,000 or however many people died, and there was obviously flow-on effects after the fact, but you could probably say in terms of like deaths, it probably actually saved lives, right? Which is kind of a bit counterintuitive, but the reality is it probably did. And I guess the decision to drop it in some ways wasn't necessarily the trigger for the global sort of arms race, for nuclear weapons, because probably other countries would have developed this technology anyway. It might have accelerated it, and I think it definitely accelerated it. But if you were resigned to sort of a perception that, well, it's only a matter of time that the Soviet Union gets this and other countries get this, then that doesn't mean this is like the decision that starts and sets that chain of motion into effect. So you can look at it in an isolated sense. What about you? What would be your arguments against?
I think, look, let's start with the fucking obvious, which is the Americans were using a technology that they didn't truly understand how it would behave, and there was no way to protect the impact to civilian lives. So the bombings, the estimations are from 120,000 to over 200,000, most of whom were civilians. And I think that, even in like a total war scenario, there's an ethical obligation to minimize civilian casualties, and they kind of knew that was the case, right?
That criticism you can make for any kind of bombing, which like absolutely is a legitimate criticism, but if the counterfactual would have been the equivalent destruction through firebombing.
No, I think it's also, go back to my first point around, they didn't know how it would behave. So they actually didn't have a good idea of...
What do you mean? Haven't you seen Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull? They tested it on themselves first.
The radiation poisoning and the fallout and the radiation sickness and all that kind of ecological disaster and things of that nature, they definitely weren't aware of. And the kind of pain and misery that caused, right? So there is probably a bit of a responsibility there. So that was one against it. And I think that there were alternatives to the bombing, right? So we talked about the reason why they wanted to do it to save lives. But I mean, one of the biggest things is that Japan were already kind of out of the war, right? And yes, there was rhetoric around, we're going to fight to the death and all this kind of stuff. But, the Russians were coming. The Russians are coming. And heavily kind of declining military operations. And so there was probably alternatives to such a show of force. There's a school of thought that actually you could have detonated the nuke in a less populated area as a show of force.
I think they also say in the harbour or something.
That's correct. Or find like a less populated city, or to kind of show how devastating it would be. And you definitely, after understanding the pure and utter destruction, did need to drop the second bomb on Nagasaki 3 days later without even really giving the Japanese a chance to...
Although, to be fair, they didn't surrender until the second one. The other piece of the puzzle here as well is that they actually didn't have enough material to have more bombs. I'm not sure if they had like one or two more, but like it was not within their arsenal to have a prolonged, bombing campaign with nuclear weapons. So they were like, we've got to like use our first ones and make them count, sort of thing, right?
I think, given the situation that there was no real case for the Japanese army to find victory, and the fact that the Soviet army was approaching, there's more than enough to say that first bomb on Hiroshima had the shock and awe that was required for the situation.
To your point with the Russians coming, like that was actually a reason to have the show of force, because they didn't want Russia having any influence in that part of the world.
And I'm going to get to that. the other bits that I want to put in there, right, is that absolutely, undeniably, and actually in declassified documents, the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was also to justify the $27 billion cost of the Manhattan Project, and as a show of force that the USA would be the global power coming out of World War II to show the Russians and other countries. So I think that going back to my framework around reasons for not dropping it, when your intention is kind of in that side away from getting Japan to surrender, which is kind of what the narrative lends on and saving lives, I think you got a few challenges there.
I think the problem, though, is that if lives are the metric that we're talking about, there was nothing novel about dropping the bomb, which is why we opened with the bombing of Tokyo, right? This stuff was happening every night, and it was happening in Europe before the bombs were dropped. And I think that's what we forget in the modern contemporary context, right? We forget that this stuff, they were desensitized to it. This wasn't a problem, like, for decision makers, because they didn't want a prolonged war. And they had gradually built up, some of the bombing campaigns in Europe were, 20, 30,000 lives, that was the max or something like that. Don't quote me the figures. But they'd already crept up to these really high numbers with Tokyo, right? So, yeah, it just didn't have that punch, right? So it was less about the action of using the bombs in that way that was the ethical consideration for them, but more like the technology and the signaling of the technology.
Yeah, I agree.
I
agree. But, and again, obviously judging, that's the context part of it, right? And the zeitgeist was very different back then. I guess that comes from that place of, all is fair in love and war. And that there are actual, a much more kind of game theory approach to all of this, right? There's moves on the chessboard, so to speak, rather than actually what do we owe to each other, other humans. And when viewed through that angle, obviously it doesn't play so well. So I think the biggest one, though, I guess, is probably where the legacy that it caused, and this idea that, as lots of people describe, rigging the houses to explode, right? The creation of the nuclear arms race, right? And what it spurred on between the global powers moving out of this World War II period.
Some of it's pretty crazy, like reading what happened in that period sort of after the bomb was dropped, right? And the war had ended, and that period of like the United States having a monopoly, a nuclear monopoly, like some of the history is wild. And some of the conversations they were having, like it was... because they were doing all of, like you mentioned, sort of game theoretic decisions. They were thinking all of this through. They were thinking, well, we've got to use our monopoly, because if we don't, we're going to lose it. We're never going to have the chance to do this ever again. And they were doing all of the maths and like the Rand Corporation, I think, was either set up or was certainly, if it wasn't set up for this, it was certainly like a part of, the intellectual powerhouse that was looking at all of these kind of issues. And it was just wild. Like, and some of the generals were advocating for it to be used very aggressively and will solve every conflict with a nuclear bomb. And, and some of these sorts of conversations continued after the Soviet Union got the technology, because there was still like that period of, well, you've got the technology, but do you have scale? And then other questions around delivery, and then they were like putting them on missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles, and there being like all these different layers,
terrestrial guidance and things. Like, I think that's the part that's really surprising to me too, that how quickly the military complex worked to adjust to the new reality. Like, never before in history did you have stockpiles of weaponry and a military complex not being able to use those fucking weapons. And it actually is like, that, because like you said, that's the generals and the people, that's their job, right? And I think that to me, it's a miracle that the governance and the politicians work so well with them to actually not use them and put the right controls in place. And that's probably due to what the legacy we're still dealing with around MAD, or mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes back to the fact that the people and the actors and the decision makers in this setting, almost to be responsible, have to make these decisions. And I guess it poses like an interesting sort of counterfactual question, which is that if they didn't make these sorts of decisions and weren't thinking and providing advice of this kind, were they actually going against what they're actually there and responsible to do? Which is why, this, it's like if your neighbor gets a dog, right? A dangerous dog, and you've got a young child. Now, you might say that your neighbor's erred by having a dangerous dog and, what a bad neighbor, but you're still going to make sure that you've got a good fence up between you, or that your child is protected. You're going to take mitigating actions in response. And that's what these people were there to do. And that was their job. And, the reason they're not the president in charge to make the decision, ultimately there's a broader perspective and they were overruled. But at the same time, you do want people like that probably giving pretty robust advice to the people who make the call.
Yeah. I mean, under that scenario, I think the only rational thing to do would be to commission a research program to deliver a nuke in the form of a bone for that dog called the Bone Buster. But no, I get it. And I think that this is where, and this is why it's such an ongoing conversation, although quite frighteningly disengaged conversation for most of us, because this is where all this philosophy hits the road, right? We can talk about, if you're a pacifist and all this kind of stuff. But really when it comes down to it, we have the day-to-day running and protecting of citizens and the stability of regions to worry about. And all you can say is, is glad that it's not you that has to make these decisions. Because like you said, these are things that there's not always a very good, a good outcome, or the price that you have to pay to get a good outcome is in effect, the cure is worse than the disease.
I do think though, like reflecting on how we today judge these decisions, we've talked about Truman and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but I don't think we can. I don't think we have the historical, we didn't live and breathe it. People today can't understand what it was like back then. It wasn't your children's lives in danger that would have had to go and fight. It wasn't your future on the line. And you just don't know the contextual. It's like when people in the future are going to look back at the decisions we made during COVID-19. What do you mean they didn't wear masks? What do you mean? What do you mean they didn't just go and get the jab? What just fucking do it. But there's all these contextual things that are relevant, and you only can know them if you live through them, and then much less, we didn't get the advice that Truman got. So how do we know what he was thinking?
Yeah.
How do we know that? So
how would they even know what to think without the visor executives telling them what to think?
Well, yeah. I mean, he didn't even know what, no, but well, I don't know if you say that flippantly, but just think about that for a minute, right? You've got a guy who is in the Oval Office for how many days? Not very long. I don't know for how long, but it was less than a year. And, he wasn't out there developing this technology out in New Mexico. He's not a physicist. He's not even a war strategist, right?
Yeah.
He's just got to make the best call that he thinks he can make in that situation. And he is reliant on his advisors. He's reliant on those people who've done all the thinking, and even those people who've used the thinking of other people and synthesized it all. He has to rely on them.
Mr. President, don't you want to at least read the option papers? I'm not paid to read. I am paid to lead.
Your opinion polling will go up.
That's right. How will this play in the South?
You might win Florida.
Yeah, but see, this is the context thing, and I totally agree. It's impossible for us to get into that mindset, and I think even to a degree, what followed, right? Because you and I are not children of, we didn't grow up with the specter of the Cold War hanging over us and the anxieties of how this played out in the years following the detonation in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? And I think, to be honest, re-engaging with this topic myself for this chat, I have been quite overwhelmed and almost a little bit disgusted by how complacent everyone is on this, right? Just for the hell of it, right? I'll kind of air my own ignorance in this respect. So when people talk about the doomsday clock, I literally thought that was a turn of phrase. I thought that was something used in literary and, Watchmen comics and things like that. It's a real fucking thing that, very, very smart, very, very clever people work together in a society of atomic physicists put together that assesses existential threat to the world, right? And for a long time it was based on nuclear issues, and now obviously has expanded for climate change and pandemics and AI and all sorts of things. But when you look at how that is moved, 7 minutes from midnight, 100 seconds from midnight, or to where it is now, which is 90 seconds to midnight, the closest to midnight it has ever been since they started making this the last 50 years or whatever. It's shocking, and no one's really talking about it, right? It's like all our houses are rigged to explode, and we just have been in this situation for so long that we just don't care anymore, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. In terms of like existential risks, like for me, it's probably one of the most salient just because there's so many ways it can go wrong. Like, I mean, I suppose just in terms of the doomsday clock and all that, like, I don't think it's a particularly scientific approach, but I think in terms of the public psychology with this, right, the first sort of third of our history with nuclear weapons seems to be just like this overreaction. It was almost like, in March 2020 when COVID got out and we were all like, oh no, what do we do? Panicking. There was a case, somewhere 50 kilometers away from my home. What's going on? Like, and by the end of it, we're like, yeah, whatever. You got COVID. Oh, that's all right. I can probably watch TV with you on the couch. You just sit on the other end. Like, there's this period of panic when something new comes. And that was like probably the first 20, 30 years of our experience with it. And then seemed to be like by sort of towards the end of the Cold War, or when things sort of eased off a little bit, tensions eased, and then certainly once the Soviet Union fell, seemed like we're in a new period of history where, I don't know, we're almost like in this new period of peace or whatever for, another 30 years, I guess. And now we're in this, probably entering a new phase where actually no, all the latent technology's there. And if in fact we've probably never had more capability to destroy ourselves, and there's probably never been as many people who could unilaterally destroy the planet as there exists today, and crazy people at that too, like thinking about Donald Trump. And we're suddenly realizing again that, actually, maybe we should be worrying about this thing again.
We're complacent with it. Absolutely right. The one saving grace about nuclear weapons, I suppose, other than all its, amazing benefits for energy production and all that kind of stuff for the science itself, is that it's incredibly hard to manufacture a nuclear weapon, right? Imagine if it was like as easy as it was to make a soda bomb. And like just everyone
would be gone. That would be the Bostrom's experiment.
Exactly. Everyone had a black marble, right? Like, can you imagine just like every now and then we'd lose like a suburb here and there, just like in someone's garage, like, oh my God, like imagine, but maybe one day it might be that easy, right? It might be able to take the world's biggest letterbox. But also I think like we've come so close. And the reason I bring up the doomsday clock too is that there have been so many near misses in that Cold War era. And obviously, the famous Cuban Missile Crisis, and you had the Russian nuclear sub that was cut off for communications after they reached an agreement to disarm, who thought that we had devolved into full-scale war. And almost, 2 out of the 3 authorizing generals were about to fire the nuke. And it was just that one person that said, no, this is like, we can't do this. Right.
Well, wasn't it? There was like another one, and I think it was a separate one to the one you've just mentioned, where Boris Yeltsin was literally advised you should deploy a nuclear weapon, but he said, no, I think I'll just I think I'll just keep my cool for a bit. Like it's
there's been so many near misses, right? Like and cooler heads prevail, right? Like it's actually, these people are absolute heroes, right? Like by no means probably of. Other than
no, but see, they're glitches in the system, right? Because like the whole point of mutually assured destruction is that these people don't exist, right? As soon as like the algorithm is triggered and computer says yes, like there shouldn't be people in the system saying no, don't do that.
But I mean, and the other one that like that really captures my imagination is the 1983 one, right? Like where they're looking at the early warning system, and the Russians can see that the system is telling them that there are 5 warheads coming to them, right? That are coming from the United States, and everything in their protocol, everything in the whole, the hammer is telling them to say, push this up the line. Counteroffensive time. This is what we agreed, right? We're getting the metrics. The system is working. And the particular lieutenant, Petrov, he just sits on it because he has his gut feel that's just like, I know if I make this call, World War III is going to start and we're going to be bombing each other. And I have a gut feel that if this was a true strike, it'd be more than 5 warheads. And that's all that he was basing it on. And he was right. It was like a glitch with sun flares. It wasn't even any warheads. And like there's just history is littered with those little near misses, those sliding doors, right? And it's just, oh my God, right? Like we are just so fallible, right?
But it does beg the question, like, so in terms of in America, like, I mean, so I'm sort of talking about America because we don't have them here in Australia, so we're kind of de facto reliant on America. But you've got like the president who's asleep at night and gets woken up and says, Mr. President, you've got 20 seconds to decide whether we, like, how do you even make that kind of a decision? And I actually think, like, if you took 100 presidents and you put them in a room and you took Donald Trump and you put him to one side and you ask the other 99, what would you do in that situation? I would struggle to think that 99 of them wouldn't just say, I just wouldn't do it. I'd just go back to sleep and kiss my wife, tell her I love her, and then that's like...
Or wives in some countries.
I can't imagine what the benefit is for you if you're going to die anyway. What's the point in killing?
Well, some people crave a legacy of any sort, I suppose.
We made sure every last one of them was gone.
But do you ever, there's that line going around at the moment. I don't know actually who the origins of it, but there is a thought experiment that says that if there was a rule where any major conflict or any war essentially had to be fought by the presidents and the ruling class's sons, that there would be no war?
Oh, of course.
Do you believe that?
Well, I mean, I believe it, but I don't know the utility of the thought experiment because that's not real life, you know? Well, we're sending drones in and stuff like that now. It's not, it's all care, no responsibility. But like, I do want to come back to, though, like, I think our generation, and I don't want to say our generation, I just mean anyone who didn't live through a world war, can be very naive about this stuff, right?
Absolutely.
Can be very sort of, oh, it was so evil for them to drop the bomb and what a horrible thing, you know, without really... Actually, now you can, if you've done all of the thinking and you come to the conclusion, yes, it was an evil thing to do or it was all that sort of stuff, then yeah, fine. But a lot of people just haven't even done the 101 on it. Like, they haven't even tried to understand what was the rationale, what was the thinking, what were the options on the table, because you can't just look at it in isolation.
Well,
yeah,
and I think that, like, to be fair to it as well, that since World War II, in terms of a narrative, the preceding wars that have occurred haven't really had the same kind of impact in terms of a clear narrative. Like, obviously, Korean War and the Vietnam War and Afghanistan and all this stuff, like, you can see why there's a very different view on it as well.
Well, there hasn't been a war between major powers.
Well, proxy wars and stuff.
Yeah, proxy wars, but that's almost the byproduct of them not wanting to go to war themselves, right? So
yeah. And then I want a full breakdown of the prisoner's dilemma, please.
Have you ever heard Bertrand Russell's tightrope walker analogy?
Yeah.
I mean, like, this is the idea that, and this is where we're sort of at in human history, and it kind of connects up a little bit with the marbles in the urn as well in some ways, in that we're, like, in the course of human civilization at the very earliest period of having this technology available to us. And the Bertrand Russell analogy is that you can expect reasonably a proficient tightrope walker to walk, you know, maybe 20 meters without falling, maybe even 100 meters, maybe even like a really good one, and a record could be even longer. But eventually the tightrope walker's got to fall and is going to mess up, no matter how good they are. And that's kind of where we are at with nuclear weapons. And now that hasn't been proven yet, but I guess the thing is, if once it gets proven, there will be no more. So, and I think that's, like, in terms of existential risks and all that sort of stuff, I mean, you know, I think that's where we're at with it. And I think why it's such a scary thing, really.
Well, yeah. And the scary thing to me is when you start to put more of your analytical capability into AI and then combine it with these weapons, right?
Oh, yeah, we should let them decide whether to pull the trigger. Do you know, like, I was reading that if we're all going to die from nuclear weapons, it actually wouldn't be the direct effects from the explosions. It would be, like, nuclear winter and, like, grains, food not growing and all of that sort of stuff.
That's right. Ironically, the answer to global warming is a nuclear winter that drops the global temperature by 2 degrees, right? And scorches everything. But you know, there's actually, like, this deep, dark rabbit hole of an industry that is around nuclear winter prepping. And so basically there's these companies and organizations that you have to pay fees for and things, and they will provide you, they'll promise you a bunker and certain kind of privileges when the nuclear fallout happens. And there's been heaps of like Ponzi schemes where there's, they took all the money and then they never built the bunker and all sorts of things. But yeah, it's when does this stuff get serious enough that you look into some of that stuff?
The other one that I was reading, some like people who look at like existential risks and look at nuclear weapons, like the reason some sort of in that community that study these things aren't so worried about nuclear weapons isn't because it's like this thing that won't have a huge impact. It's that they prefer a scenario, or at least when they do run the numbers and the analytics of it, the fact that a nuclear holocaust would not kill like 100% of people on the planet, that it would only kill like 99%. That 1% is like considered viable enough to repopulate the planet over millennia.
Ooh, like a Zion theory.
Yeah, so you don't have to worry about an event that kills only 99%. You only have to worry about events that kill 100%. And so, I think the impact is still very profound, but yeah, they say that it probably won't cause the extinction of humans and human civilization. It would just severely reduce our population.
Yeah, set us back to the Dark Ages maybe, but yeah.
Do you think nuclear weapons killed the dinosaurs?
Well, this is actually a really interesting thing, right? So say that we do fumble the black marble, right? And 99.9% of us are obliterated. And so we're all gone, and then the future that grows up and that evolves and repopulates the Earth have no memory of our civilization. Yet there are all these sites that hold nuclear waste. Like, if you had to design some kind of signage for this new this new generation of inhabitants, like, how would you do it?
So what you're saying is that the pyramids of Giza are actually a big nuclear waste dump.
Yeah, there's some their version of like uranium rods down there, or their Chanel.